Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy for the People, and I think today Ben is sufficiently out in London that we're only live on This Is Revolution and not on Give Them an Argument. Also, while I am going to talk about the apocalypse, I wanted to first talk about my lighting. Something just as important as the apocalypse is my lighting, because I've been using my allegedly good webcam, which is this one, which looks like this, which I suppose looks a bit more human, bright, but it automatically defaulted to my bad camera today. And actually, I feel like I much prefer this kind of grayscale, kind of more grey, dull image. But perhaps that's just me having weird preferences. So if anyone has any thoughts on the matter, feel free to put it down below in the comments or in the chat. But yes, today I want to talk about why do we want the world to end? Why is there so much talk about the world ending? So the most recent kind of allegedly apocalyptic drama has been the idea, which purportedly this was something that was only spoke about really before the election, and then after the election, when the alleged bad outcome happened, there's been a lot less talk about it. But there's been a suggestion lately that the 2024 election in the United States, if Trump won, would be the last US election. And, wouldn't we be all so lucky if we never had to go through another American election? And that is kind of the optimistic pessimism which is going on in these apocalyptic pronunciations by those who, they just want a bit of damage, a bit of crushing desire, a bit of everything being smashed to pieces. Of course, in reality, I think the rituals of American elections, at least, will last for a very long time. Of course, one can complain that, perhaps in the future, these American elections will become less competitive. But, having sat through quite many American elections, and I'm sure people in the listening will more often than not feel the same, it's not exactly like there's been a great deal of competitive options offered to the American public so far. I mean, there's the classic quote of America and its kind of largesse having a one-party state with two parties. But within these conditions of a stagnant, declining, cruel present, the lack of political hope leads to a transference of political hope from any kind of utopia, or not even utopia, but just any kind of progress, to the apocalypse. Back in the 20th century, there was this possibility of a real apocalypse in the later half of the 20th century, the threat of nuclear war. Widespread apocalypse would be a genuine, sharp, quick apocalypse. Everything, in a matter of a day, less than a day, would rapidly change across most of the countries in the world. And the rest of the countries in the world, which wouldn't be immediately nuked, would kind of be radically changed over the next weeks and months, as there would be both global climate effects, a total collapse of the global economy, as well as the biggest refugee crisis that humanity ever faced by an order of magnitude in all likelihood. Though, notably, after such a war, there'd be this period of great and utter chaos, but afterwards, more likely than not, this slow slide into decline and oblivion would resume instead. nuclear war remains something which may happen, especially in recent years. We're turning back to nuclear war. Nuclear war is discussed again, though we don't really seem to be scared of it anymore. We seem perfectly happy. The West seems perfectly happy for their allied militaries to literally start a ground invasion of Russia. Biden showed off that, actually I stopped Putin from using nuclear weapons in Russia, in Ukraine rather. Freudian split there. Which of course just shows in like a lowering of restraint around the nuclear barrier. There's a kind of a paradoxical effect that we fear nuclear war and weapons much less now, and so they're much more likely to be used. Very, very, very spooky. But regardless of how likely or not likely nuclear war is no longer imagined as the apocalypse when we think in terms of what sort of apocalypse is going to happen. Rather, what is imagined instead of a nuclear war, I'm developing a cold, as you might have noticed. Obviously, I got it when I was out with Ben on Friday. Rather, what is imagined than nuclear war is climate change, fascism, plagues, and so on. But notably, each of these things, even structurally, like kind of almost necessarily, are not sharp shocks out of a system, but rather a slow decline into oblivion, a slow evolution of a system for the worst. If we take seriously claims of American fascism as regards the Republican Party, then this will be a fascism which develops not out as a clear break from American institutions, but through them. You know, with the kind of most powerful institution that's consistently on the Republican side being the US Supreme Court, which is, prototypically American and prototypical of the American Republic, rather than anything which is a break from it. Decline is something which represents a clear political opportunity for everyone, but of course, in our context, we'll speak about its relevance for the left, for socialists, for communists, and so on. But I think what's notable about decline is it only represents a political opportunity when it's understood as decline. Our societies are declining, but they're not in the midst of an apocalypse. And it's important to frame your political discourse around this question properly if you don't want to be seen as ridiculous. When these slow evolutions of systems for the worst are portrayed as a catastrophe, they become ridiculous. Climate change is portrayed as if it was going to drown and boil us, while the reality is that we're more aptly the crab being slowly boiled in the pot. When I was younger, I'm sure people of the same sort of age remember, there was a great deal of concern around sea level rises. Specifically that, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, sea level rises were kind of like an imminent threat, which would immediately threaten coastal cities with destruction. But 25 years on, 20 years on, this is not proven to be the case. Which is not to say that, there are some places in the world where sea level rises are going to become apocalyptic, already or almost apocalyptic. Specific places in the Pacific and specific places in the Indian Ocean, which were very, very low to the ground, these kind of atolls. But sea level rises are not presently an apocalyptic threat to the United States, the United Kingdom, and they're unlikely to be anytime soon. And the portrayal of them as such has the effect of kind of delegitimizing claims about climate change as a threat, as an obvious and pertinent threat to human society, in the sense that it will cause a decline rather than an apocalypse. Climate change is something which advances generationally, with young people not knowing what went before. So currently, the United Kingdom is much warmer than it was when I was young, and again much warmer than it was when my parents were young. And so I don't remember times when it was like there was snow on the ground for like 2 weeks or something like this, or there was an actual winter season where the ground was frozen for a couple of months or anything like that. Nowhere near that. Probably only my grandparents remember a time like this. But then for people that are a generation younger than for me, snow, even in northern England, is like a rare treat, a purely kind of occasional matter, which could not happen in a year. It's unlikely to not happen in a year, but it's entirely possible, at least in any substantive way. God, I'm just going to be sneezing and snuffling. I mean, this is, instead of an apocalypse, we're faced with a decline in my head health as I sniffle and sneeze and blow through this episode. What is an apocalypse? In this context, I understand an apocalypse, or an end to the world, to be a sudden, sharp change in the world, such that most of the key features we understand to constitute the present are abolished, but specifically in a negative way, and not in a slightly negative way, but a radically negative way, in a way which destroys most of human lives and most human productivity. And a breaking up of especially of the global economy, or at least one which will be almost unrecognizable than what came before. The closest thing we had to kind of a realistic apocalypse in our imagination would be like a mega COVID. A COVID which happened, but we weren't quite able to manage it. In reality, COVID was managed in the end by health authorities basically everywhere in the world, such that it did not become apocalyptic or anything close to apocalyptic. In the United Kingdom, there were warnings at various points of kind of the health service no longer being able to take on people, like things were at a breaking point, but things never broke through that breaking point. And instead, what COVID caused in the UK was decline, especially within the health service, which still hasn't kind of caught up to where it was before. There was a massive problem with waiting lists in the UK, as in how long you wait for certain kinds of treatment, like a knee replacement, things which are very important for your health, but don't really absolutely have to happen within a certain time period, as opposed to other health services like abortion, which obviously happen to happen in a certain period of time. And these delays were massively accelerated by COVID, but COVID was not the cause of some grand apocalypse. Fictional apocalypses, I think, still not quite as popular as it was before. Yeah, COVID 2 is dropping. Fictional apocalypse is often framed in terms of a zombie apocalypse, which is an interesting idea in itself. And there's plenty of leftists theorizing on zombies as kind of the feared other and so on. But there is this bizarre phenomenon where people seemingly prepare for the zombie apocalypse in real life, even though there's not really any way for there to be such a thing. And all the kind of allegedly scientific explanations of a zombie apocalypse which happen in fiction are normally pretty radically unconvincing. And any actual zombie apocalypse would die out pretty quickly. So, to be clear, if 9/10 of the human population were killed, but somehow global capitalism remains, then this is not an apocalypse. God damn. And if global capitalism disappears while population and productivity is maintained, then this is like a utopia. This is basically, if not communism, something like that. Because any prior system of human organization of production and population, like feudalism, would not be able to maintain current levels of production. While capitalism, obviously capitalism is excluded because in this context we're abolishing capitalism, so there'd have to be a progressive step forward. And so this is kind of making clear the one-sided utopia of the apocalypse. Apocalypses are appealing because we don't like the society that we live in. They're appealing because they abolish all the current conditions and thus abolish all the conditions about the present world that we don't like. And if we don't like more of the conditions than the ones we do like, then of course there is a certain appeal to anything which offers to abolish them, even if that thing is in of itself unappealing. To be clear, I think it's relatively rare for people to explicitly want an apocalypse. Rather, they're fascinated by them, they find them very interesting. They don't explicitly want them. If you ask them if they want them, they would say no. Though, of course, people do express sentiments like this, but they're usually fringe people. The classic formulation of, no, my ideology will be the one to rise from the ashes. This is appealing because those who advocate, who say this, they see the possibility of their ideology, their perspective, their politics as gaining power under normal circumstances as being so impossible that the only way they have a chance is if all the conditions which they think are holding them back are abolished. And then surely in this new society or new shadow of a society, they will prevail. Of course, should be an idea which is least appealing of all to communists, because for communists, communism requires a very high level of productivity to come into being. It is the state of production which is past capitalism, which is past the mass production of capitalism. And basically any apocalypse either brings us back down to a level of pre-capitalist production, or at the very least abolishes global capitalism such that we end up somewhere in the 19th century. And of course, the mid-19th century is the place you want to be the least. Of course, it was important that we transitioned to that time in order, to get to a better place. But we don't want to go through the pain again as a human society. From normal people, the fascination is not a political one, but is kind of a contrast with the dull, depressive decline of everyday life. As some fine ladies on the Red Scare podcast said once upon a time, don't kill yourself because something R-worded might happen. It's also in this context important to talk about the news so described. The news is notable for being, these days, almost exclusively understood and taken and engaged with as a form of entertainment rather than a form of information. And the only media which seems to have at least, and it is the only media which seems to have at least a pretense of a direction instead of an endless rotation. Cat videos have not really evolved over my lifetime. The kind of stuff I see on the internet, which isn't the news, I almost always could have seen when I was 10, 20 years younger. The only stuff which isn't is pure kind of technical innovations in terms of, like, back then when we speak of cat videos, we mostly mean like sub 1 megabyte, sub 1 megabyte kind of GIFs. While now, these cat videos all have sound and they're actual videos and so on. But of course, more often than not, they have sound, but then this sound is just horrible TikTok voice, or it's fucking it's like horrible copyright-free music that they play in the background, or it's both of these at once. And so in there's this technical innovation, but actually that causes the product to decline because I'd rather not hear this music. I'd rather not hear the TikTok voice describe the video when I can simply witness the video. I don't need the music. I don't need the TikTok voice. But even within the news, progress is very slow. Even when something happens, nothing does. So COVID happened. Yeah. When COVID was happening, we can, very clear example of my lack of predictive powers. When COVID was happening, I thought it was complete bullshit. It was just another media hype thing. In the end, nothing would really come of it. China would defeat it, blah, blah, blah. It wouldn't get anywhere. As many other, and of course that was kind of on an inductive basis. All the other alleged plagues that were going to destroy global capitalism in recent years, in recent decades, all didn't become anything, like SARS and bird flu and pig flu and all the other stuff. But then kind of something did happen. Lockdown happened and all this happened. But lockdown as an event, as a real kind of social event, was about the most boring one you could have. And after, the first bit of excitement, lockdown became very, very dull for very, very obvious reasons. COVID, once it became a real thing, was expected to be something that would be the end of all things. Or at least it would spiral sharply in a certain direction. But that's not what happened. Rather, things grinded on and off for 2 years, just about successfully managed by the state, resulting in conditions which were just the same but worse. That's kind of the motto of our time. Everything stays the same, but it gets worse. We also have like land wars between like at least decently proper military forces, but even these manage to be dull. Israel seems to have followed the Russia model, and they've managed to make a campaign of genocide against a civilian population defended by some small ragtag Islamist and communist militias into something which is incredibly slow and dull. They've managed to make massacres in schools and hospitals dull just through repetition and just through slow timing. The same thing in Russia with Ukraine. Russia is invading a European country in a land war between two sovereign nations for the first time since, I guess, the Second World War, unless I'm forgetting something. I guess the stuff like the fucking invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact doesn't really count. It wasn't a land war. This is a pitched battle on the same place as the Eastern Front of the Second World War between two proper armies of tanks and planes and so on. And it's dull and it's incredibly slow and it's uninteresting and nothing really happens. Nothing really goes anywhere. It just grinds on and on and on without seemingly any real direction or purpose or anything else, apart from the mass destruction of human lives and human infrastructure and the human economy and so on. And this dullness just further pushes us towards dreaming of a proper apocalypse. Because if plague and war are insufficient to make the world interesting, to make the news interesting, then surely nothing is, apart from a real, proper end of the world. Sorry if the text is a bit small. It's just full screen me. What is decline? Why is there decline? Decline is the general worsening of circumstances, normally in a slow and steady way. More familiar, it's something which is more familiar to recent generations. Millennials, especially, are confronted with decline after a long history of progress. I'll mark this out a bit more later, but there's an interesting structure where people are genuinely inclined to be pessimistic about the future, or perhaps not pessimistic about the future, but kind of optimistic about the past. Um, Everyone is inclined to think the time of their youth was better than the present. And generally they're mistaken. And I think on just some level people grasp that they're mistaken about this. And they don't really think the world has declined, or they think the world has declined kind of morally, or there's less of a caliber of person these days, and everyone is weak and so on. But they accept and often point to the fact that material circumstances have improved exactly to prove that people in these times are weak. But that's not what's happening anymore. What's happening now is that there's a real actual decline on any level, on every level. So maybe our moral character is still declining, but it's also going down as our wages do. Decline is happening for two main reasons. First, there are the internal features of human global society, namely capitalist stagnation and exhaustion. It seems, especially recently, that capitalism has really ran out of its innovative power. It seems really that we're at the end. It seems it doesn't have a really lot else to give us, and the only place where capitalism seems to be prospering and progressing is under the stewardship of the Chinese Communist Party. There. Ew. Delightful. And this is something which is discussed mostly in the context of the third world, but what I think is neglected is that it's also true of the third world. Places in, like sub-Saharan Africa, is very poor now, but it was also very poor in the past. India is very poor now, but it was also very poor in the past. And I mean, India is maybe just about progressing, though it's notably India is now deindustrializing. India, it's interesting, Marx obviously thought that India would industrialize quite soon, like in the 19th century or the early 20th century. Not only was he wrong about that, but it seems now that India may never industrialize. India is probably never going to become an industrial society, because we obviously live in a world where kind of we're past the peak of industrial employment, unless again there's an apocalypse. And India was never an industrial society, and now it's absolute, and in absolute and relative terms, its manufacturing population is declining. So it seems likely that India will never be an industrial society, which indicates that kind of the optimism that Marx had about capitalism, at least in this regard, was mistaken. If obviously capitalism has developed the world economy, but it has not developed it universally, and it seems it never will develop it universally. But it's also important to place this within a context which goes beyond capitalism, which goes beyond any particular feature of human society, and goes instead to features of the geography of the planet that we live upon. Human society doesn't exist in a pure kind of economic void, rather exists within and on a particular planet with particular contingent features, and human civilization is now being stymied by those features. The main contingency here is that industrial civilization. That was a very interesting pronunciation of civilization. Industrial civilization was able to develop because of trapped carbon stores. But the use of these stores then caused climate change, which then later impeded human progress. Human industrial progress was much faster than kind of an imagined average civilization because of this trapped carbon storage that we had, which allowed a rapid development. Coal was so important for the development of human industrial civilization. But this very burning of coal, and then gas, and then oil, is now stymieing human civilization, is holding it back because climate change is damaging human productivity. Notably, these two factors of industrial civilization and its relationship to the contingent features of our planet are both causing each other, as well as holding each other back from being solved. The fact that climate change limits human productivity limits our ability to respond to climate change. The decline also further encourages our desire for the apocalypse. It's not just that life is dull, but it's something that's marching towards oblivion. So why not have the apocalypse happen? I don't really know why. I think this slide was necessary. At least I've basically covered it already. Though it has reminded me. I've said oblivion so many times this episode without mentioning that Oblivion is also the name of the best role-playing game ever. Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Hope you've all played it. Very, very good game. The best ever. So I've already mentioned that the apocalypse offers the possibility of exciting viewing, something fun to watch on the TV, but it's also attractive in the sense of promising an exciting life for you, the viewer. The reason we turn towards wanting to witness exciting media that has some direction is that we live dull, unsatisfactory lives which lack any direction and seem to fit in within a declining world where we'll have to try harder to get less. And at the same time, there's never been a point where we've been so engaged with media. If you go with the ratio of kind of how much time humans spend engaging with actual real other humans versus the amount of time they spend talking to a webcam or listening to a person speaking to a webcam speak. There's never been a point in human history where people have spent more time engaging with media in ratio to the time they spend engaging with real, actual other humans in their lives than right now. And what is portrayed in media is something which is much more exciting than our daily lives. Like imagine if it wasn't, imagine if everything on the TV was just kind of long documentaries about very dull people going about their very dull lives, not really doing anything. Such programming is not evolutionary favored. It's disingenuous. It will not prosper. Rather, what we want is exciting media, but then this creates kind of a fast meal of life where we all want the exciting lives which are portrayed to us in the media, which are either actually fictional, or in the case of documentaries, social media, reality TV, and so on. They portray a kind of like a fast meal of a real life, like a hyper-real version of the world, but of course aren't portraying normal human life, but are exactly interesting because they don't portray normal human life in normal ways, but rather portray us in different, more interesting circumstances. They portray the rare and the unusual, not the dull and the normal. It's not at all surprising then, within these circumstances, for our mind to reach towards the apocalypse as a tool which could free us from the dullness of our life and set us free to live short, brutish, terrible lives, but in a way where, your heart would really be pumping every day. Resentment and resentment, the normal kind, as a pusher for apocalyptic visions, should not be underestimated. This also links to a desire for decline and for focused apocalypses. After Brexit happened, there was a great deal of desire from Remainers to see the whole process make the people who vote to see Brexit. They wanted Brexit to make the people who voted for Brexit suffer. They wanted them to see. They wanted it to be revealed to them what the Remainers knew all along, that Brexit was bad and Brexit's going to make us suffer and make us terrible things happen, And so there's a desire for decline, for bad things to happen. Yeah. And of course, when Trump happens, I've had to put that in plural now, because it's happened twice. And when Trump happens, liberals bubble up with this immense desire for a great and vicious tide to consume everyone they think failed the Democrat Party. So, it's gone beyond kind of in the recent spurt, people just saying, oh, I hope you get deported. Rather, people now say, I'm going to report this person. I'm going to, the day after the election, there was posts of tens of thousands of votes on Reddit, and the person Twitter tens of thousands of likes from people being like, oh, I'm going to report my Mexican neighbors because I think one of them voted for Trump or whatever. We're really gripped with the idea of leopards eating face. This is a tweet from a while back where I can't remember. I don't know if he's British or American or whatever. But this guy posted a tweet saying, woman who voted for the leopard eating party says, I never expected the leopards to eat my face. Where people who take themselves to be kind of wise and above the herd deeply desire for the herd to be punished for the bad choices they see that they've made. And of course, on the right, this isn't a desire which is even behind sort of kind of like a pretense, or it's behind, it doesn't have to be revealed by a particular event happening. Rather, on the right, there's a direct and explicit thing of like, we're going to punish our enemies. We're going to crush our enemies, especially in the American right. And there's probably something that liberals could learn, that, you don't want to come out of the desire to crush your enemies after you've already lost. That's actually the worst time to do it. If you're going to desire to crush your enemies, you should desire it beforehand and kind of plan and, use that desire and to push yourselves to win. Because otherwise it's a desire which won't be fulfilled, apart from kind of through the mistakes of your enemies. In the absence of a possibility of seeing a better future, we instead desire our enemies to be the ones that suffer and die first. Why is there a spinny circle? Decline, of course, represents a great opportunity, as I mentioned at the start. We're in a circumstance where people are being absolutely, not just relatively, disadvantaged. Marx had his immiseration thesis, which said that the conditions of the working class would decline over the course of capitalism, which is regarded by some as obviously false because, of course, the condition of the working class has improved. But what is, I think, clearly meant here is by Marx is that the condition of the working class would relatively decline in reference to the upper class. And this is something which, though additionally, there was a long period in time where this wasn't the case. The working class was not declining in relation to the ruling class, rather they were gaining after the great, enormous, crushing defeat of the working class, which happened during the process of industrialization, probably necessarily. Um, the working class then fought back in the 19th and 20th century. But this is, of course, I don't think something which denounces Marxism. Rather, it's something which kind of proves the thesis that the condition of the working class did not relatively or absolutely decline because of the actions of the working class. But then, once the working class was defeated during the 70s and the 80s, and essentially almost kind of, not on a material level, but on an ideological level, dissolved itself, we all became consumers and, baby capitalists and rent seekers and so on. The relative and absolute decline of our position in relation to the capitalists, to the owning class, began. In these circumstances, it's not particularly difficult to convince people that the current order of things is not very good. But this is something which makes evident the problem with a focus on the end of the world. Leftists screaming that the sky is falling are more likely to elect a reaction of, yeah, so what? Rather than a gasp of amazement. It often seemed leftists are stuck in the past, insisting to people that things are getting worse and worse after decades of people thinking that things are getting worse. I'm probably exaggerating there with decades. How long? Yeah, it's been 16 years since 2008, 2007, so it's almost decades. This is something I also mentioned earlier, but there's a natural inclination to people to think things are getting worse throughout human history. The 4 ages of the Greeks, we want to go back to the ancients, understood human society as kind of ever declining. But I think it's interesting to talk about this in the case of Greek society, especially in the Greek Dark Ages, being a post-apocalyptic civilization. There has been one apocalypse in human history that we know about, which was the collapse of the Mediterranean economy during the process, which I've forgotten the name of. The attack of the sea people, blah blah blah, I forgot the name. But anyway, in this time, human civilization around the Mediterranean essentially collapsed. And it's very plausible to me that this perception of a decline in human history, which is common in Western civilization, has a great deal to do with this ancient memory of the Bronze Age collapse, which I just remember the name of. But regardless, this tendency is very widespread to see, things as getting worse all the time. And things did objectively again get worse during the 19th and 18th century, after a prospering of the working class from the 14th to the 17th, after the Black Death. So if people were convinced that things were getting better for a couple of iterations, really convinced, really believed it, that was the aberration, not a current moment of decline. And right now, people are right that human society is getting worse, that it's declining, unless you're Chinese or whatever. People know that things are getting worse. The issue is that people don't see an alternative. And often what people get in response is not a close to ground alternative, but a dream of utopia as an alternative to the end of the world. with the two just being as healthy as the other. The synthesis of these two positions, I think, is very clearly degrowth socialism, one of the most obvious misnomers to ever be written. But degrowth socialism is, I think, a perfect combination of dystopia and utopia, where it's imagined we can have socialism via the collapse of human productivity, via the deliberate reduction and destruction of human productivity. I will end on returning to a Stefan Bertram special, which is the emphasis, once again, that things can always get worse. A push towards apocalyptic visions, a reason that people are inclined to them or not very inclined against them, is people often think, well, surely things can't get worse. And while I understand why people might think that on some level, this is an incredibly bizarre way of thinking. Of course things can get so much worse. Things have got worse recently, but they're so much better than living in the Bronze Age. And then, living in the Bronze Age is so much better than living during the Bronze Age collapse, and so on and so on. Even in Gaza, which is presumably the worst place in the world to live, apart from probably certain places in South Sudan at the moment, even in Gaza, things could get worse than they currently are. It came out recently that during one of the camp clearances, these ghetto clearance operations by the IDF, in one area, the IDF gathered all these Palestinians up, divided them into men, women, and children, kind of kept children here, grabbed all the men and took them away to God knows where to be summarily executed or put in prison or whatever. And then they had the women sat in ditches. And, they dug these ditches and forced these women to get in them. And then they were circling them with tanks and armored vehicles and spraying dirt on them and so on. And all the women in there were like, oh, we're about to be murdered. We're about to be murdered in full, like, SS Eingruppen style. But then instead of going full SS Einsatzgruppen, the Israelis were like, oh, you can go now. Go one by one, grab a child. It doesn't matter if it's not yours, just grab a child and march south. And that's an incredibly terrible thing. That story I've just told is really terrible, but it's also one which would really obviously get worse, because the Israelis could have just shot those people. And if they had, they probably would have got away with it. If they hadn't got away with it, it would be in a quite limited sense. I think this is another key problem with decline. No matter how good things are in the moment, if things are getting worse compared to a previous point, people remember this. People who remember this will be immensely dissatisfied. And it prevents them from really caring about a grand apocalypse. In other terms, the problem with decline is it stops us from seeing the apocalypse as a problem, leading to us desiring the apocalypse. And that concludes the first ever Philosophy for the People exclusive solo episode on This Is Revolution podcast, and not on Give Them an Argument, because Ben didn't bother to put it on because he was so otherwise engaged. Of course, I could have taken further steps to make it be the case, but I didn't bother to check, and I thought this is probably going to happen. I was like, whatever. As noticed, I'm a bit ill, so I'm not desperately and overflowing with desire to really resolve anything. Another sight of the other camera. Oh, whoopsie doopsie. Whoopsie doopsie. Yeah, to this camera compared to da, 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 compared to oh, um, compared to this one, which I wanted to compare. Usually at this time, I would I would wait and ask for questions and so on. But because of the viewership being halved by the fact that we're not on Give Them a Revolution at the moment, I take it that there'll be sufficiently few questions. There's no punch doing such, and in part because because of how slow I've been speaking, I've nearly done an hour anyway, rather than when I normally do the solo thing, when I normally do about 35 minutes before running out of steam. Rather this time, I managed to get to 52 just of my own blathering and sneezing and slobbering. So I will play the outro. And goodbye to you all.